There had been nearly 6 weeks of painful silence before the tragic discovery. And when the discovery happened, it came just shy of the 5th anniversary of the event which made Charles Lindbergh the most famous person in the world. Almost exactly 5 years before the day which was probably Lindbergh's worst, he experienced his best. Starting on May 20th, 1927, he flew a small airplane nonstop for 33 and a half hours from New York to Paris. He became the first solo flyer to cross the Atlantic Ocean without stopping. And in doing so, he achieved a level of fame which is hard to imagine in today's age of instant global connectivity. 5 years later, he and his wife Anne and their young son Charlie were at their new house on a 400-acre estate outside Hopewell, New Jersey, when the family's nightmare began. The Lindberghs bought the estate with the hope of finding privacy from prying eyes of the press and the public, and in the first 2 months of 1932, they started spending weekends at their new house even though it was still under construction. They spent the rest of their time at the home of Anne's mother, about an hour north near the big city of Newark, New Jersey. On Monday, February 29, 1932, the family had been scheduled to travel from the Hopewell estate back up to the home of Anne's mother. But a frigid winter storm kept them at Hopewell for 2 extra nights. Little Charlie, who was a year and a half old, had a cold, and the family didn't want to travel while he was sick. On the night of Tuesday, March 1st, there were 6 people in the Lindbergh house: Charles, Anne, and Charlie, and then the husband and wife butlers and the nanny, Betty Gow. Betty laid baby Charlie down in his crib in the second-floor nursery sometime between 8 and 8:30 p.m. When she returned to check on him at 10 p.m., he was gone. The kidnapper or kidnappers left behind the first of what turned out to be 13 ransom notes which the Lindbergh family received over the next month. On the night of April 2, 1932, Charles Lindbergh drove to a cemetery in the Bronx with Dr. John Condon, a man who had been acting as an intermediary between the kidnappers and the Lindberghs. Charles Lindbergh handed over $50,000 in cash and gold certificates, which could be spent like normal money. In return, a mysterious figure who called himself John and claimed to be one of the kidnappers provided directions to the location of baby Charlie. The child was supposed to be on a boat near an island off the coast of Boston, Massachusetts. But when the authorities scoured the area, they found nothing: no boat and no baby Charlie. After that, there was only silence for nearly 6 weeks. The kidnappers had their money, and they sent no further communications. New Jersey authorities released details of the man called John and offered a $25,000 reward for information. They received thousands of tips, but none led to John. And then on May 12, 1932, there came the devastating discovery. Delivery driver Orville Wilson and his assistant William Allen stopped for an ordinary roadside break less than 5 miles from the Lindbergh estate outside Hopewell, New Jersey. Scanning the vicinity, they noticed something unusual in the tree line. Upon closer inspection, the grim sight solidified their worst fears. In the brush, they found the remains of a small child. The next day, May 13th, the child's identity was confirmed. The remains were those of Charles Lindbergh Jr., the missing son of the world-famous aviator and his wife. A cursory autopsy revealed Charlie had died from a fatal blow to the head on the night of his abduction. And the findings exposed the cruel hoax by the kidnappers. The 13 ransom notes, which said the boy was alive and well, were all lies. The boy had likely died within minutes of being taken from his nursery. The discovery was heartbreaking for the family. It was headline news around the world, and it was frustrating for investigators. The kidnappers were in the wind with $50,000. Investigators had no leads on their identities and had seen no sign of the ransom money. They would wait 2 long years for a break in the case, and when it came, it led to an unlikely suspect. From Black Barrel Media, this is Infamous America. I'm your host, Chris Wimmer, and this season we're telling the stories of some of the most notorious kidnappings in American history, the crazy events which surrounded each abduction, and the chaotic investigations of the cases. This is Episode 2, The Lindbergh Baby Part 2, Bruno Richard Hautmann. The New Jersey State Police was technically still in charge of the investigation, but on May 13, 1932, the day Charlie Lindbergh's remains were identified, the Bureau of Investigation officially partnered with the New Jersey State Police. 37-year-old Bureau Director J. Edgar Hoover had offered his agency's assistance 2 months earlier, right after the kidnapping, and now the agency took a larger role in coordinating all relevant federal agencies to find the kidnappers. The Bureau was undergoing rapid changes as the level of violent crime exploded in the 1920s and early 1930s during Prohibition and then the Great Depression. Al Capone's gang had battled Dean O'Banion's gang in Chicago. Lucky Luciano emerged at the top of the Italian mafia after the bloody Castellamarese War in New York and the series of murders which followed. Bank robbers prowled the countrysides in cars with V8 engines and Tommy guns with 100-round magazines. And, starting with little Charlie Lindbergh, kidnappings for ransom were on the rise. The Bureau wouldn't add federal to its name and become the FBI for another 3 years, but its stature was growing after it played a major role in solving the infamous Osage murders in Oklahoma in 1929. And now, in May of 1932, Bureau agents revisited every detail of the case and re-interviewed the Lindbergh household staff. Nearly everyone believed the kidnappers must have had inside knowledge of the Lindbergh's family home and routine. Then, less than a month after Charlie's remains were found, there was a shocking development with one of the few people who had that knowledge. Violet Sharp was a maid at the Morrow Mansion where the Lindbergh family spent its time during the week. She was one of the small circle of people who would have known that the family chose to stay at the Hopewell estate 2 extra nights rather than return to the Morrow Mansion. The Bureau of Investigation was about to re-question her when she swallowed poison and died on June 10, 1932. Investigators had already determined that she played no direct role in the kidnapping on the night of March 1st. But when she had been interviewed originally, her behavior and her shifting stories were suspicious. Now she was gone, and her possible involvement would likely remain a secret. The staff at the Lindbergh house, butlers Elsie and Oliver Whately and nanny Betty Gow, were rechecked and cleared. No one believed members of the Lindbergh family were involved, so investigators were out of likely suspects. With no further viable leads, the Bureau of Investigation led the effort to trace the money, which was an excruciatingly slow ordeal. The process involved coordination between federal agencies, banks, and businesses nationwide, and it went on for more than 2 years with no results. In September 1933, more than a year into the process, the IRS joined the operation. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued a proclamation urging that any ransom bills be returned to the United States Treasury. Since the ransom was primarily paid in gold certificates featuring unique serial numbers, pamphlets listing the numbers were distributed far and wide to banks, grocery stores, gas stations, department stores, and post offices. For another year, there was nothing. Finally, in August 1934, the breakthrough happened. 16 gold certificates surfaced in New York, scattered across the Yorkville and Harlem neighborhoods. Each bill was painstakingly traced back to its origin. Then, on September 18, 1934, a bank teller received a $10 gold certificate which he believed matched one from the ransom list. And he was right. Investigators swiftly traced the chain of custody to a gas station in New York. When agents approached the gas station, the service attendant seemed almost prepared. He had been suspicious of it when it was issued. The gold certificates were a fading currency form at the time, When a man used a $10 gold certificate to buy $5 worth of gas, the attendant wrote down the license plate number of the man's car. Investigators learned that the car was registered to Bruno Richard Hautmann, who lived at 1279 East 222nd Street in the Bronx. Hautmann's address was just 2 miles from the Woodlawn Cemetery, where Dr. Condon and Charles Lindbergh had given $50,000, mostly in gold certificates, to the mysterious kidnapper known as John. Surveillance began almost immediately. Hautmann fit the general description of John, and his background as a carpenter would have given him the knowledge and ability to make the crude ladder that was used to reach the second-floor window of the Lindbergh nursery on the night of the kidnapping. He drove a green car, which appeared to be similar to the one that was reported by a witness as being seen in the area of the Lindbergh house on March 1st. Investigators learned that Hautmann, a 35-year-old German immigrant, had previous convictions for robbery. On September 19, 1934, Bruno Hauptmann was arrested for the murder of baby Charlie Lindbergh. Analysis of Hauptmann's handwriting found similarities to the ransom notes. And, most damning of all, $13,000 in gold ransom certificates were found hidden in his garage. Bruno Richard Hautmann vehemently denied involvement in the crimes, but on October 8, 1934, he was indicted for the murder of baby Charlie Lindbergh. Hauptmann's defense attorney, Edward J. Riley, famously known as Big Ed and the Bull of Brooklyn, took the case. At 52 years old, Riley was a seasoned criminal defense lawyer who had handled more than 2,000 cases and secured acquittals for many. But his reputation was mixed. He was known for his showy courtroom theatrics and his heavy drinking. The trial began 3 months later, on January 3, 1935, in Flemington, New Jersey. The pressure on law enforcement and the prosecution to deliver justice for the Lindbergh baby was immense. The courthouse became a magnet for celebrities, high-profile journalists, and public figures, while the general public followed every development through radio broadcasts, newspapers, and newsreels, which were shown in theaters before movies. More than 700 journalists flooded Flemington for the trial and created a media frenzy for a case that was dubbed the crime of the century. It was at least the second case up to that time to wear the title of crime of the century, after the Leopold and Loeb murder case of 1924. Baltimore newspaperman H. L. Mencken, who became famous for his witty quotes, called the Hauptmann trial the greatest story since the resurrection. The trial appeared to be leaning in the prosecution's favor from the start, but the prosecution, led by David Willents, faced its own challenges. Willents was a World War I veteran and graduate of NYU Law School, but he lacked experience in criminal trials. In fact, the Lindbergh case was the first criminal case he had ever tried. Yet, with confidence and precision, he presented a series of damning pieces of evidence. His strongest highlight was revealing that $13,000 of the ransom money had been found hidden in Hauptmann's garage. Willents then revealed that wood from Hauptmann's attic floor matched the ladder used in the kidnapping, which made Hauptmann's carpenter background incriminating. Additionally, Willents presented evidence that Dr. Condon's phone number and address had been found written near a door frame in Hauptmann's home, and handwriting analysis revealed close similarities to the ransom notes. Adding to the tension was Charles Lindbergh's testimony. Lindbergh recounted how, on the night of the ransom drop, he accompanied Dr. Condon to a cemetery and overheard the kidnappers speak 2 words, "Hey, doctor." Lindbergh claimed the voice belonged to Hauptmann. But Dr. Condon, the only person who interacted with the kidnapper who called himself John, wasn't so sure. Condon should have been the prosecution's most damning witness, but he introduced confusion and controversy. During a police lineup, Condon initially stated Hauptmann was not the man he met in the cemetery during ransom negotiations. But on the witness stand, he identified Hauptmann as the kidnapper known as John with certainty. This contradiction created a storm of confusion. but it bolstered Willins's determination to paint Hauptmann as the villain. Willins closed his case by outlining the horrific details of baby Charlie's final moments. Willins proposed that Hauptmann climbed up to the nursery window using the makeshift ladder, but while climbing down with the child in hand, the ladder broke under the extra weight. The fall caused Charlie's fatal skull fracture and killed the boy quickly. While much of the evidence was circumstantial, Willins's storytelling gripped the jury and left an indelible mark. Now, it was Edward Riley's turn to defend Bruno Hauptmann, and it would be an uphill battle from the start. Although the evidence against Bruno Hauptmann was largely circumstantial, the prosecution's narrative of guilt was compelling. Hauptmann's defense attorney, Ed Riley, faced a monumental challenge. He began with Hauptmann himself, who took the stand to address the most incriminating evidence. Hauptmann claimed that he had been given the ransom money by chance. According to his testimony, his friend Isidor Fischer, a fellow German immigrant, had entrusted him with personal possessions before leaving for Germany in December of the previous year, 1934. Fischer didn't trust banks, which was a common and understandable feeling during the Great Depression. Before Fischer left for Germany, he had handed Hauptmann his belongings for safekeeping. Months later, Hauptmann learned that Fischer had died of tuberculosis in Germany. With Fischer gone and unable to reclaim his property, Hauptmann said he began sorting through the items and discovered the ransom bills among them. Hauptmann had no way to return the money, so he used it. Next, he pointed out that his fingerprints were not on the ladder that was used in the crime or anywhere in the Lindbergh home. Additionally, he alleged that he had been coerced by police to simulate the handwriting that was used in the ransom notes. He claimed he had been beaten into replicating the ransom notes' misspellings and style. But when it came time to support Hauptmann's claims, the defense struggled. For the defense, the figure of Isidor Fischer was significant. If he were the kidnapper, known as John, it would explain the German accent heard by Charles Lindbergh during the ransom drop at the cemetery. And, of course, it would support Hauptmann's explanation for how he had received the ransom money. But when Hauptmann's lawyer, Ed Riley, began calling witnesses, they were ineffective at best. The defense's final argument leaned heavily on the theory of an insider's involvement in the kidnapping. Riley suggested that Violet Sharp, the maid at the Morrow mansion who had taken her own life, played a role in the kidnapping despite being cleared by the police. Riley theorized that the baby's disappearance occurred without alarming the family dog because the kidnapper was familiar to the household. Bruno Hauptmann had no direct connection to anyone associated with the Lindbergh family. Hauptmann's acquaintance, Isidor Fischer, could have been the man known as John who handled the ransom drop, but someone else was probably the actual kidnapper. And that someone was either a member of the Lindbergh inner circle or connected to someone in the inner circle, like Violet Sharp. It was admittedly a tough sell because there were so many suppositions and missing links. Lastly, Riley argued that the latter was merely a theatrical element to deflect suspicion onto an outsider. After 5 weeks, the trial drew to a close, and the defense team would have to hope it did enough to help Hauptmann. Prosecutor David Willins delivered a closing statement that painted Hauptmann as a cold-blooded menace. Willins left little to the jury's imagination and called Hauptmann the lowest animal in the animal kingdom. Willins branded Hauptmann public enemy number 1 of this world. And the label public enemy number 1 carried serious weight in February 1935. The previous year, 3 notorious bank robbers had worn the crown of public enemy number 1: John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson, and they had all died violent deaths. Bruno Hauptmann's trial started just 6 weeks after Babyface Nelson was killed. When prosecutor David Willins grouped Hauptmann together with the bank robbers, it almost certainly wasn't an accident. On February 13, 1935, after 5 weeks of testimony, the jury spent just 11 hours deliberating its verdict. The courthouse bell rang at 10:28 p.m. The courtroom filled, and the jury foreman announced Bruno Richard Hautmann had been found guilty of first-degree murder. Hautmann was sentenced to death. When questioned about the electric chair, Hautmann stoically replied, "You can imagine how I feel when I think of my wife and child, but I have no fear for myself because I know that I am innocent. If I have to go to the chair in the end, I will go like a man, and like an innocent man." Bruno Hauptmann appealed his conviction over the course of the next year. A high-profile criminal attorney named Samuel Leibowitz implored Hauptmann to confess in exchange for leniency from the death penalty, but Hauptmann refused. Along with continuing to profess his innocence, Hauptmann's only comments about the case were that one man could not have pulled off a crime of this magnitude by himself. Notably, New Jersey Governor Harold Hoffman expressed doubts about Hauptmann's guilt, and he agreed that there had to be more people involved beyond Hauptmann. Though his intervention provided a short stay, he was unable to prevent the execution. On April 3, 1936, Bruno Richard Hautmann was executed in the electric chair for the murder of baby Charlie Lindbergh. Hautmann professed his innocence to the end, which ensured that theories about the case lived forever. The official narrative said Hautmann was the sole villain, but decades of research cast doubt on the idea. Legal scholars, authors, and criminal attorneys have churned out alternate theories. Some completely exonerated Hautmann, while others assumed he was one cog in a much larger machine. One theory strongly suggests John Knoll, another German immigrant with a grudge against Lindbergh, may have been the puppet master. Police sketches strongly resembled Knoll, and he allegedly had a suspicious lump on his thumb. Dr. Condon, who coordinated the ransom drop and met the kidnapper known as John twice, remembered the detail about the kidnapper's thumb. Some modern handwriting studies have suggested there is a 95% likelihood that the ransom notes were written by John Knoll and not Bruno Hauptmann. But handwriting analysis is extremely limited, and it's viewed as a pseudoscience by many investigators, so it's hard to tell if the studies have any value. Psychologists point to motive. Hauptmann, a carpenter with no vendetta against Lindbergh, seemed a lackluster choice for such a high-stakes crime. Meanwhile, Knoll's apparent obsession with the aviator and his envy over Lindbergh's fame seemed a more likely reason. Knoll was a young deli worker, but he was able to afford first-class airfare to Germany immediately after Hauptmann's arrest. Finally, Hauptmann was found in possession of 1/3 of the ransom money. If Hauptmann were involved, maybe he was an accomplice and John Knoll was the mastermind. And while theories swirled around Hauptmann and Knoll, others speculated about Charles Lindbergh himself. Lindbergh was never a suspect during the investigation or the trial, but in the years since 1932, the darkest conspiracy theory centered on Lindbergh. Disturbing details of so-called pranks by Lindbergh led some to revisit the aviator's involvement. Months before the kidnapping, Lindbergh reportedly hid baby Charlie in a closet. According to the story, for 20 minutes, he let his wife and nanny become frantic as they believed the boy was missing. That incident would have explained Anne Lindbergh's early reaction on the night of the kidnapping. When the nanny, Betty Gow, discovered baby Charlie was missing, she and Anne searched the house. When they didn't find the boy, Anne confronted Charles and demanded to know if he was pulling another prank. He denied it, but that didn't stop some people from thinking that the baby's death was a prank gone terribly wrong. And the darkest theory involving Charles Lindbergh was that the baby's death was not an accident, but a deliberate act by a father who was fixated on genetics. The theory said that Lindbergh had exceptionally high expectations for baby Charlie, as the son of the world-famous aviator. Rumors have lingered for nearly 100 years that baby Charlie may have suffered from several health conditions, including a malformed skull, hammer toes, and a condition that weakened his bone development. Those who wanted to believe the rumors wondered if Lindbergh, who might have been desperate to maintain appearances under intense public scrutiny, could have tried experimental treatments which went catastrophically wrong. And then, the kidnapping and murder were staged as a way to conceal an unthinkable mistake. It's certainly the most extreme of the conspiracy theories, but it hasn't gone away. Lindbergh, of course, was one of the few people who knew all the details of the house and the routines of the people inside it on the night of the kidnapping. He inserted himself into the investigation to a large degree. He bombarded law enforcement with demands. He limited the reach of those who might expose a hidden truth about baby Charlie's health. He refused to allow an autopsy and insisted on immediate cremation after Charlie's body was found. The theories around Charles Lindbergh were wild, but with no direct evidence that connected Bruno Hauptmann to the actual kidnapping and murder, and with Hauptmann's professions of innocence until the day of his execution, speculation about Lindbergh and others continues to flourish. In August 1932, 5 months after the kidnapping and 3 months after the discovery of Charlie's remains, Anne Lindbergh gave birth to the couple's second child. He was a boy they named John, and his earliest years were overshadowed by grief and a desperate attempt by his parents to introduce a modicum of peace and order into their lives. The investigation dominated John's first 2 years, and the trial and its aftermath dominated the third. The press hounded the family nonstop. One day, as Charles Lindbergh was driving John to nursery school, Lindbergh's car was forced off the road. 2 men emerged from the other vehicle and snapped photos of John before speeding away. That was the clincher. Charles and Anne Lindbergh had hoped the 400-acre estate outside Hopewell, New Jersey, would be a sanctuary of peace and privacy. But that hope ended with the kidnapping of baby Charlie. In 1935, after the trial of Bruno Hauptmann, the Lindbergh family fled to the European countryside. The family's former nanny, Betty Gow, took a similar approach. She returned to her home country of Scotland within a couple years of the kidnapping. Despite being cleared of any wrongdoing, Betty was the last to see baby Charlie alive, and she felt the weight of blame hanging over her. A letter she sent to the Lindberghs went unanswered. But 60 years later, in 1993, a Lindbergh biographer interviewed Betty Gow. He had also interviewed Anne Lindbergh, who lived until 2001. The biographer told Betty that Anne sent her regards, and the message brought Betty to tears. At 88 years old and long removed from the case, Betty Gow found a tiny bit of peace about the tragic experience. Meanwhile, Anna Hauptmann, wife of Bruno Hauptmann, steadfastly proclaimed her husband's innocence until her last breath. Facing relentless public scorn, she and her son Manfred tried to live quiet lives, but were constantly haunted by the past. Refusing to change their last name, Anna worked tirelessly to support her son and find justice for Bruno. She filed lawsuits alleging a flawed trial and evidence which had been withheld, but the lawsuits went nowhere. The most enduring result of one of the most infamous criminal cases in American history was the creation of landmark legislation. On June 22, 1932, about a month after Charlie's body was discovered, Congress passed a bill known as the Lindbergh Law. It made kidnapping a federal crime and granted the Bureau of Investigation, and later the FBI, immediate jurisdiction over the case if a victim was missing for 24 hours. No one wanted a repeat of the confusion and bureaucratic restrictions which had infected the Lindbergh case. At the height of the Great Depression, local police forces were overwhelmed and under-equipped. Cases floundered as communication between states broke down. The Lindbergh Law unified efforts and improved success rates in kidnapping investigations. Between 1932 and 1939, the FBI investigated 144 kidnapping cases, and it solved all but 2. The Bureau averaged 2 major cases per month, as kidnappings for ransom became big business for criminals during the Great Depression. In July 1933, while the Bureau was 1 year into its investigation of the Lindbergh case, George Machine Gun Kelly orchestrated the kidnapping of an oil baron in Oklahoma. The Bureau of Investigation caught Kelly and ended his long criminal career in September 1933. 2 months later, in November, the Bureau dove into a case in Northern California. A young man named Brooke Hart had been kidnapped, and the 2-week ordeal led to total anarchy and mob violence in the city of San Jose. Not even the FBI could stop it. Next time on Infamous America, 2 men abduct 22-year-old Brooke Hart, the heir to a department store fortune. The kidnappers believe they have a brilliant plan to extort money from the Hart family. It's certainly a brutal plan, but it's not as brilliant as they think. When it unravels, no one is prepared for the reaction of the people of San Jose, California. That's next week on Infamous America. Members of our Black Barrel Plus program don't have to wait week to week to receive new episodes. They receive the entire season to binge all at once with no commercials, and they also receive exclusive bonus episodes. Sign up now through the link in the show notes or on our website, blackbarrelmedia.com. This episode was researched and written by Mandy Wimmer. Original music by Rob Valier. I'm Chris Wimmer. Thanks for listening.